All right, Peter. You're 23 years old, is that correct?
I'm 27.
27?
Yeah. Animal Planet doesn't update their bios so often.
And you don't have your own Wikipedia page, so...
Right.
That made that difficult. All right, well, you're 27 years old. I think at your age, a lot of people have gotten into the workaday world, the corporate world, and obviously you chose a much different path in life. How did you come to realize that that was the path that you wanted to take?
Well, when I was about 14 years old, I saw a picture of a whale being pulled up the slipway of a Japanese factory whaling ship. And what I saw surprised me so much because, like most people, I thought whaling was something that ended in the mid-'80s. Which it did. There was a ban on commercial whaling passed. And yet what I found out is that ever since that time, Japan, Iceland, and Norway had killed over 40,000 whales. And when I saw that image, I realized that here's a situation where the governments of the world had really failed to protect these animals. And so I needed to take it upon myself to protect them. And so I originally joined Greenpeace. I became somewhat disillusioned by what I saw as a very passive response to something incredibly violent, which was whaling. And I looked for an alternative, and that's why I joined Sea Shepherd when I was 18. And I joined Sea Shepherd because it's the most aggressive, most effective marine conservation group out there.
How did you avoid the pitfalls that most people at that 18 years of age get into with debt and needing a job for whatever reason?
Well, I went to university. I took student loans, but that loan money, rather than going towards my studies, went to get airfare so I could join the ship. I guess it's just a matter of prioritizing, and I think the issues that we face as a species in order to survive on this planet are so incredible, almost insurmountable, that it requires effective action, and it requires action, direct action immediately. And so when looking at just the simple figures, where you look at the fact that we're facing this massive extinction period, when you look at the fact that the oceans are in absolute turmoil and crisis, where if you just look at shark populations, for example, and shark populations in the North Atlantic have fallen by 95% in 3 decades. That's just one example. And so I think when you're looking at that, it requires a shift in focus for your life. And I decided to dedicate my life to defending animals that have no ability to defend themselves, and to work to protect a natural world which I feel has an intrinsic value in and of itself, a value outside of what the economic values that we as humans place on the natural world.
Okay. Within that system of economics that we are so encapsulated in, is it possible to be a responsible and sustainable consumer?
Well, for sure. I mean, I think what we require in order to basically turn this tide of destruction that we're facing, it requires not just us looking at our own lifestyles and changing those, which I think is very important and necessary, but it also requires us to take action on these different issues. And I think, you know, throughout history, evil things and bad things happen when good people stand by passively and do nothing about them. And so when you look at issues like whaling, you look at bluefin tuna fishing, you look at sealing, and you look at all these other destructive practices, almost all of which are illegal against the law, when they do continue and governments refuse to take action, then I think we have a responsibility to take that action. And so these problems don't go away simply because, you know, we change our eating habits, which we should do. They don't go away because we simply donate to other organizations and hope that they take care of these problems, which is important, but it's not enough. To stop these destructive practices from happening, our own personal involvement is required. And that's what's so great about Sea Shepherd, is that our ships are run almost entirely by volunteers, and that means that the donations that we receive go straight into our fuel tanks.
Do you see an end at some point to your work with Sea Shepherd?
I don't think my work will ever end. Captain Paul Watson has been doing this for 40 years, and I certainly think that we can end whaling in my lifetime. I'm certain that we can end whaling in the Antarctic in the next couple of years. We saw the end of pretty much the complete destruction of what was left of the commercial sealing industry in Canada a couple of years ago because of campaigning there. So I have every reason to be hopeful. But there's certainly no lack of issues that we have to tackle in order to defend the oceans, in order to protect the oceans. So once we win on the Antarctic whaling case, then, you know, I don't think I'll ever be retiring. I think the only way to get me out of this line of work is for me to either die of old age or for me to get killed on the high seas. I don't really see any other alternative.
Okay. In this line of work, what has been the hardest thing for you? What has been the greatest sacrifice that you've had to make?
Well, people often ask me if I'm ever scared with the work we do. I mean, what Sea Shepherd does is we deliberately put ourselves in very dangerous situations. But I'd be hard pressed to say that I'm frightened very often. I think what I do is I look at it from the perspective of these animals that I'm there to protect. And a couple of years ago, our helicopter filmed a whale being harpooned down in the Southern Oceans, and this whale was too far away for our ship to intervene. So the helicopter captured that entire kill sequence on film, and from the time she was harpooned to the time she died, it took 22 minutes and 40 seconds. And in that amount of time, she was harpooned twice, she was shot another 7 times by rifle shot, and it took 22 minutes and 40 seconds for her to slowly drown in her own blood. And when I think about that, I recognize that nothing that I myself could experience down there can compare to that. And so my fear is not anything that can happen to me personally. You know, my fear is not doing enough, and my fear is living in a world without whales, and my fear is looking my children or my grandchildren in the eye in the future. And when they ask me, hey Peter, you know, when you were 27, scientists were saying that the bluefin tuna in the Mediterranean was going to go extinct in half a decade. You know, what did you do about it? And I want to be able to look them in the eye and say, I did everything that I possibly could to stop that from happening.
Do you plan on having children?
I do, yes, someday I hope to have children. I don't really have time to have children right now, but certainly I recognize that a lot of what we do is for the animals that we're trying to protect, but it's also for future generations. And you know, it's also for, you know, the generations that will inherit this planet. The Iroquois, the First Nation people here in the United States, the Iroquois had this rule where any decision that they would make, they would have to take into account 7 generations from them. And certainly that's not something that our leaders today do at all.
Going forward from that, you've been to the Southern Ocean for a lot of years now. What changes have you seen in that area of the world, just meteorologically speaking?
Well, I've been to Antarctica 7 times. Mm-hmm. I've probably spent almost 30 months down there trying to stop the Japanese whaling fleet from killing whales. What I've directly seen as a result of our efforts is almost 4,000 whales that are swimming free because of our interventions. And last year we were able to prevent the Japanese whaling fleet from killing 729 whales. The year before that we prevented them from killing 863 whales. And those are animals that are swimming free right now off the coast of Australia, having their calves because of the interventions of a small group supported by those who share our values. And so I've certainly seen that, but I've seen the effects of global warming as well. And I remember us going around this massive bit of ice that had broken off the Ross Ice Shelf, and it was about the size of Rhode Island, and it took us literally 24 hours to circumnavigate this berg. And that's why when people ask me, well, why do you focus on whaling? There's all these other issues that, you know, cetacean species face, you know, that other issues that threaten their survival, ocean pollution, global warming, and all these other things. And I think, well, here's, you know, I usually tell people then that whaling, here's an issue it's been illegal since 1986, but we have public opinion on our side, we have the law on our side, and yet it still continues. This is a barbaric, cruel practice that has no place in the 21st century. This is something that we should be able to eliminate immediately and without hesitation. And we should do it immediately because there are all these other threats facing their survival.
Peter, college students in the United States today who are our audience, what can they do to help?
Well, I think the environmental movement has its strength in diversity, and just like an ecosystem does, biodiversity is its strength. And I think that the environmental movement needs everything from doctors to teachers to lawyers to the people that are willing to literally place their bodies on the line and sit in a small rubber boat and block a harpoon from killing a whale. It needs every single one of those things. What is lacking, I think, is for people to do it sustainably, and for people to be resilient, and for people to continue in one direction, and to focus the amount of time and energy that's required to save these animals and protect the natural world. So I would ask people to look at their own strengths and their own passions, and then apply those strengths and passions to protecting the natural world, and then to move in only one direction, and that direction is forward.
I was just curious if you ever watched Whale Wars, and what do you think in terms of its representation of the realities, you know, how close it comes?
Right. Well, Whale Wars is a docudrama, so, and almost like a reality show, but not really. But as with reality shows don't document the entire reality. It's an alternative reality. But everything that happens in Whale Wars is what happened in place. The only thing that might be different is that something that took days takes an episode, takes 40 minutes, right? And so a 4-month campaign that we do, maybe a month of my life gets condensed into about 2 minutes of looking for the Japanese whaling fleet, whereas a 1-day-long engagement might be half the season. But what's great about Whale Wars is that we allow the documentarians unrestricted access to the entire ship and unrestricted access to the crew. And so we have nothing to hide. And so they are really, quite literally, they're like flies on the wall. There's, you know, what they are, they have no influence in what we're doing, they're not part of our strategy, we're simply doing what we would have done whether they're there or not. So they're just there to film. And what's really neat about that is that we go down to one of the most remote areas of the world. Very few people will ever experience Antarctica, even fewer people will ever experience what whaling is like down there. And you know, the crew that I'm on, the ship that I'm on, the Bob Barker, I have a crew of 28 souls on board. And what the cameras from Animal Planet allow us to do is literally bring millions of people along with us. And I think what Whale Wars does is it reaches an entire section of the population that would otherwise not receive our message, or that wouldn't read about us in the Wall Street Journal, or read about us in the New Yorker, or read about us in the Vegetarian Times, or wherever, whoever's covering us. And I think that's incredibly neat. And I think it's opening up a lot of people's eyes to what's happening to whales, and you know, by extension, what's happening to the oceans. And I think one of the reasons that the oceans are in such a bad state is because people rarely think about what happens to the oceans, because it's something that's out of sight and out of mind, and destructive fishing practices happen under the surface, so people don't see it. But my hope is that Whale Wars gets people to think about the oceans, but it also inspires people to see that here is an example where individuals can make a difference. These people are no different than me. These people have jobs like me, they have mortgages like me, they have kids like me, and hopefully then they find the courage to take action in their own lives to make this world a better place.